And what's fascinating is that rarely is critical race theory described today as tracing back to those German Marxists that I told you about from the 1920s. But if you read the work, especially of Angela Harris, Derek Bell, you will find that they will cite Marx. There's a remarkable quotes, especially from Angela Harris in the early 2000s, about her admiration for Marx's perspective and how they are all, everyone in critical theory, whether it's critical legal theory, critical race theory, critical fat studies, I mean, any number of developments of critical theory, you have this notion of the world being divided between oppressors and the oppressed. Each is just sort of adding their element of oppression on top of it.
I don't think there's anything more informative or entertaining than a couple of white guys talking about racism. So, without further ado, Jonathan Butcher is from the Heritage Foundation. He's a fellow in education, and he's concerned about critical race theory being taught in schools, and so am I. Jonathan, thanks for being with us. I appreciate it.
Great to be here.
All right, let's do a little definitions. I've heard the term critical race theory. And I'm hearing it more and more as I listen to my kids' classrooms now that they're online and being taught at home. Let's get some definitions. Critical race theory, explain it.
The critical race theory is a worldview that says everything around us should be viewed through the lens of race. And when I say everything, that includes government, that includes our legal system, includes schools and instructional content, as well as cultural and social questions that we see around us. It's a worldview that's built on top of a broader philosophy that has deep roots in Marxist and socialist ideas from about 100 years ago. So critical race theory is very much an American phenomenon that developed over the last couple of decades. But that's the focus. The focus is on race, on your identity as part of an ethnic group.
I want to get into the history of this because I'd really like to be enlightened on it. But when you say everything, who you are is based on your skin color, you're not joking. I have seen it firsthand now that I get to listen to these lectures coming through my kids' computers. And I'm getting lectures on critical race theory in English classes and yoga classes and all sorts of inappropriate places. And one of the slideshows said, you came from this group of people, and this is your identity. It will be your identity forever. It is who you are. I found that so repugnant. Let me tell you, my skin color does not tell anybody who I am. Who I am is a very individualistic person. It is not based on some group or tribe that I associate with. And I found this to be so remarkably anti-American and so remarkably collectivist, and also in the worst way. It's not even saying you are what you believe in. It's not you are what your political values are or your religious values. It's not anything you've decided. It's not even, if you think you're a boy or you think you're a girl. It's you have no choice. Your identity is your skin color. And I've seen it. And this is what blows my mind. Where in the world did this come from?
Well, when you opened, you were saying that it's, the two of us talking about race, really, or two of us talking about critical race theory. I don't think that frames what we have here. What we have here are two Americans very concerned that what's going on in culture today violates the accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's what we're talking about. And I don't think it matters the color of your skin or your country of origin or your gender. To be treated differently because of your immutable characteristics is contrary to America's creed. It's contrary to not just what we were taught to believe, but the shoulders on which we stand, from Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr. and beyond. So,
Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote that seems to ripple past the generations is, "Don't judge me by the color of my skin, judge me by the content of my character." Critical race theory that is being taught in schools and echoed in their yoga classes and their English classes and math classes teaches just the opposite. That is, judge me by the color of my skin. I don't understand how anyone can celebrate Martin Luther King and hold this viewpoint.
Well, they don't. The founders of critical race theory and those that came before in critical legal theory have stated specifically that they feel like the civil rights movement didn't accomplish enough. They question the liberal order, so liberal as in representative government and the rule of law, and they believe that American law is and institutions are systemically racist. And they say it just like that. Right?
You used a term I haven't heard before, critical legal theory.
So I think a bit of history is in order. So let's start with a quick example from today. In California, some school districts have gotten together and developed a math curriculum called Equitable Math. And in that curriculum, one of the lines says it recommends to teachers that they should adjust homework policies based on the color of their students' skin, based on their students' ethnicities. Okay, so think about that for a minute. Let that saturate your mind.
I'm sorry. Stop. My old mind has to catch up with this. So I've always heard that, math is math, 2 + 2 = 4, unless you're living in 1984, the book where 2 + 2 = 5, because that's what the state decides. You're telling me under this new proposed policy, students of color might get less work or be scored on a different score sheet that is grade inflation because of the color of their skin. Am I following this?
That's what's in the curriculum.
How is that not blatantly racist and building an educational ghetto for black kids? This is a way to keep black kids on the lower rungs of society because they're going to graduate thinking they understand math when they don't. How disgustingly racist that is.
It absolutely is. So how did we get here, right? So where did this come from? And that's just one example. I mean, the example I gave you is a very quick one. There are others that we can talk about in a little bit. But let's rewind for a minute and let's go back to Germany in the 1920s, where you had a group of German Marxists who were frustrated that the working class had not staged a revolution to overthrow the existing government like had happened in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution at about the same time. And so this group of German Marxists became known as the Frankfurt School because they were housed at the University of Frankfurt. And what they intended to do was to combine the Marxist idea that the world is divided between oppressors and the oppressed based on economic classes with Freudian's postmodernism, that there isn't really an authentic truth that we can make decisions based on. That there's not.
You used another term that I want to clarify: postmodernism. I've heard this tossed around a lot. My understanding of it is something like this. There is not objective truth. There really is subjective truth. And so whether it's the Constitution or the sciences, it is what we decide it is as a society. How close was I?
Yeah, exactly. Max Portheimer, who was one of the directors of the Frankfurt School and one of the most widely known, described it like this. He said that every fact exists in certain circumstances and is impacted by the circumstances and the situation in which that fact exists. So if that's not murky enough for you, I think the description that you gave, that there is not objective truth, it fits just as well.
So if I'm looking at this table right here, and I put a lot of drinks on it. It is a circle. The top of this is a circle. For me, that is an objective fact, but to postmodernists, maybe it isn't.
Right, exactly. And that kind of lends itself to the writings of Derrida and Foucault, who are other intellectuals of that time who like to use language to uncover and develop and find biases that existed in language. That was something that is a part of this postmodern perspective. So once the Frankfurt School in the 1920s decided that they needed to find a pure or authentic Marxism, they got together in the 1930s. And as the Nazis came to power, because most of the members of the Frankfurt School were Jewish by ethnicity, by origin, the Nazis chased them out of Germany. They bounced around Europe for a little bit and then found a home at Columbia University in the United States in the 1930s. From there, they influenced generations of students, especially in law schools. And that's where the idea of critical legal theory was developed. So we have our notions of Marxism and of postmodernism. And now we're going to add on top of that the critical legal perspective that American law is systemically oppressive. It was built to keep marginalized people down, people of minority ethnicities from succeeding. So that was the critical.
Could you give me an example or two of that? They must have them. That this system of law is meant to keep people down. I would throw out, for instance, certain drug laws. That the difference between sentencing for people who used crack cocaine versus cocaine were very different. Cocaine were done mostly by white people who had a lot of money, and crack cocaine was a lot cheaper and done by minorities who couldn't afford cocaine, but yet they were sentenced in two different ways. Crack cocaine had a much higher punitive rate. You'd go to jail longer than this one. Isn't that proof of what they're saying?
Well, and if their ideas had been developed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they could have easily pointed to the education system and segregation among schools. They could have pointed to housing redlining, both of which did exist. And they were problems in American policy at the time. But their ideas mostly took flight in the 70s and into the 80s. And they were still pointing at the effects of those laws and saying, no, it doesn't matter what you do to American law. It can never separate itself from the past. The ideas of racism are ingrained in what is in American law. And to give an example of this today, this is the idea that influences, say, the 1619 Project, which has gotten a lot of attention over the past year. One of the lead ideas from that project is that America's founding documents, America's founding ideals, were false when they were written. So the problem is not just American law. The problem is that our creed is racist on its own, right?
Wait. The very statements in the Declaration of Independence were wrong. Mind you, this organization, the Independence Institute, is based on what we believe to be eternal truths in that document, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed with certain rights, including life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, all sorts of rights. That's not true? All men are not created equal?
Well, the conversation, it takes on shades because race is such a hard topic in the United States because of slavery and because of the Jim Crow laws and because America is built on a promise. And so we have to be able, as Americans, regardless of the color of your skin, to say in the same breath that we condemn racism, we condemn Jim Crow laws, we condemn discrimination, but a lot has happened in the last 60 years. The promise that our founding fathers left for us today is being carried out. It started and was continued through the Civil Rights era and by the Civil Rights Act in 1964. You cannot change a culture with the switch of a button or even signing into law something as profound and important as the Civil Rights Act. But because the Civil Rights Movement and because of the examples before and since then, we now have a culture in which we can say it is our obligation to fulfill that promise that the founding fathers left for us. And by doing so, we can say, no, this nation is not systemically racist. Our government is not systemically racist, and our institutions are not systemically racist.
The history of this is fascinating. Bring us to the present. Why am I hearing that you are your skin color? That is your identity. In my kids' yoga class, in my kids' English class, in my kids' econ class, I'm hearing this come through the computer. How did we get from there to this?
So as we went from critical legal theory, so critical legal theory was spreading among law schools in the 1960s, 70s especially, and into the early 80s, that's where we find critical race theory. And critical race theory, race theorists will describe their lineage in the same way. They will say critical legal theorists had a number of very good ideas, and so they're going to add on top of critical legal theory's ideas the idea of race. They will add the concept that not only is American law systemically oppressive, it is oppressive because of racism. And so critical race theorists added race to the mix. And so that was their contribution to the critical canon. And what's fascinating is that rarely is critical race theory described today as tracing back to those German Marxists that I told you about from the 1920s. But if you read the work, especially of Angela Harris, Derek Bell, you will find that they will cite Marx. There's remarkable quotes, especially from Angela Harris in the early 2000s, about her admiration for Marx's perspective and how they are everyone in critical theory, whether it's critical legal theory, critical race theory, critical fact studies, any number of developments of critical theory, you have this notion of the world being divided between oppressors and the oppressed. Each is just sort of adding their element of oppression on top of it. From critical race theory, it's easy to step into schools, right? Because critical race theory, just like critical legal theory did, spend lots of time in the American university system, right? The critical theorists landed at Columbia. Some spent time at Berkeley, as probably would surprise no one. And many of these ideas were developed throughout journal articles, conferences, books, and all of the speaking engagements and writings that these professors did over the years. Of course, teachers, before they enter the K-12 classroom, often go to teacher colleges in universities. And so that is where they find the ideas of Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or Gloria Ladson-Billings, who wrote Just What is Critical Race Theory and What's It Doing in a Nice Field Like Education, which is an article that is one of the seminal articles of critical race theory in the past 20, 25 years. And so as teachers are exposed to that, then they will take it to their classrooms. And I think what is most pertinent today is because we're in this moment of, once again, I think some toxic racial conversations, not helpful racial conversations, but very divisive cultural moment about race in America. Critical race theory is sort of seizing the vacuum and filling it with its ideas.
We say here at the Independence Institute that politics is the lagging indicator of culture, and culture is the big driver. And culture has changed over the last 50 years, that the left has complete control over the great pillars that echo what culture is. They control education, they control entertainment, and they control the media. So I've seen that over and over, the story, the plot line, the news article is about the oppressed versus the oppressor. This is the viewpoint that is seen. Now, this is the progressive viewpoint. My viewpoint sees a very different battlefield. My battlefield is between people who want liberty and those who want coercion. That the battle is between my right to make my own decisions versus coercion. And that's my battlefield. And I get it. We see two different things. So we could look at all sorts of issues and see two very different things. One wants to right the wrongs of the past. But they want to right the wrongs of the past by doing exactly what the past did, discriminate based on race. I want to fix the crimes and misdeeds of the past by making sure people have the liberty to direct their own lives, to keep their own money, to build their own jobs and their own interests. And this is such a clash of visions. But I got to tell you, the older I get, the more depressed I am seeing that this idea that you are who your victim group is rather than who you make yourself is ripping us apart. And the big fear I have is this race to celebrate victimhood. I look at somebody like Henry Ford. Henry Ford did more to get poor people out of poverty than anyone in American history. He democratized mobility so that people could live where they could afford and go to a job which is most profitable for them. And a middle class exploded. Now, to hear it the other way, Henry Ford is an oppressor. He's a rich guy, and we should vilify him for being wealthy, because wealthy people made their money based on racist policies. Today, the race is, or the goal is to say, I'm a victim in this way, I'm a victim in this way, I'm a victim in this way, versus I'm empowered to do this. I am what I've created. I am what I do. I am what I believe. And these two visions cannot exist in the same way. I worry that it will destroy what made the United States the beacon of liberty, where people went to write their own biographies, where people died to get in to have a better life. I see critical race theory as a way to create a massive welfare and transfer state. I would love for you to tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I think that what you describe is pretty frightening. I think it is an accurate description of the application of critical race theory and what it does to the culture that it exists in. Just as slavery and Jim Crow laws and discrimination could not coexist with America's creed, and this was recognized by intellectuals and writers and thinkers from the 1940s and 1950s in through the civil rights era, neither can those same forms of discrimination exist today and peacefully coexist with our creed of freedom and opportunity for everyone. I would add that it's important to recognize what the culture that came out of especially minority communities after the Civil War, even before the Civil War, and in through the early 1900s. There's a terrific book by a professor at the University of Texas about entrepreneurship and Black Americans. And it talks about how they developed a culture under the most difficult of circumstances, under slavery, under the Jim Crow era, of entrepreneurship, of self-help, of establishing schools and universities when none were available to them, provided by the government. It's a remarkable story of how even under the most difficult of circumstances, a culture of entrepreneurship and self-actualization was able to thrive and develop. And these are the kinds of ideas that we as Americans should embrace as our own and be ready to celebrate, because imagine what is possible when discrimination is not a part of the American system. I mean, look, the fact is that as humans, racism and discrimination are sad parts of our fallen nature. That doesn't mean the government should condone it. It means that as a culture and as our representative system should reject it every time it rears its ugly head. And so that's where we find ourselves today. We find ourselves today in a system that is pushing away from the past of discriminatory laws and of racism, and being forced back into a situation where people are being asked to be judged by the color of their skin once again.
There's also objective, I know that's not a good word, objective proof that this is not a systemically racist country. I find it fascinating if you dive into census data on race and income, what you find that people with dark skin who are in the United States, who are from the Asian world, the Indian world, are making more money annually than white Americans. In fact, those immigrants and people who have come here from the Ivory Coast and Nigeria, people with black skin make nearly double what Black Americans make. So I have to wonder, how is it that if we're systemically racist and Black Americans who've come through the ranks of slavery who are making less, owning less, have a less quality of life than white Americans, how is it that black guys can come into this country and build wealth that is greater than white Americans? If, in fact, this is a racist society, well, those black people should be held down, but they're not. And the only way I can explain it is they see opportunity. They have an ethos of directing their own lives. They are not celebrating victimhood. They're not leaning into victimhood. They don't want transfers of wealth. They want opportunity, which has always been what has brought all races to this country. This is what scares me the most. One, that people are going to start believing we're systemically racist, and that the response is, as you put it at the beginning, a completely Marxist response. Well, what we need to do is redistribute wealth, and that way the oppressors will finally pay. Where does this all end? And let me ask you a different question. This is depressing as hell, and I hate it. Give me a reason for hope that this victim celebration could change. Real quickly, we only have a couple minutes.
Sure. Well, let me say too, Brown professor Glenn Loury, who's been outspoken on this issue, has said that if America was systemically racist, then why do we find so much educational content teaching critical race theory? Why do we find this spread among the academia of all of these different ideas? Those ideas would not be allowed to thrive if we were systemically racist. So I think he makes a great point there. I would say too, so reasons for hope. Many state lawmakers in places like Texas, Idaho, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and other states around the country.
You mean the racist states?
Well, I mean, some, right? I mean, Idaho, some are in the South. Idaho, I don't know if I would always, not being one who's an expert in elections, let's just say that it is in various parts of the country, right? Arizona has one now as well. But they are considering proposals that have some important language in them that says that no teacher or student should be compelled to adhere or affirm or profess the ideas that are contrary to what's in federal civil rights law. So, for example, they cannot be compelled in a school to say that one race is superior to another, or that people should be judged based on the color of their skin, gender, or national origin. So these proposals are now making their way and becoming examples of how we can set up the next generation for success and, frankly, reinforce what is already in federal civil rights legislation.
So there's reason to be hopeful. Also, I think when we see this, particularly being pushed by government dollars, like in government education, parents and others have a responsibility to blow the whistle on it and bring it to the school district, bring it to the press, and get people to understand what's going on. I think there's a personal responsibility that we need to point to this racism when we see it.
Without question, and state lawmakers can actually help by making public school curriculum more transparent, by saying that taxpayers should be able to see what is being presented to students before it winds up in their backpack. And that's not impossible, especially after this pandemic showed that all students had to learn online. So there's no reason you can't post a link or the list of textbooks or worksheets on a syllabus so that taxpayers can see it.
I want to thank you so much for this, and I know right now when I ask you, you've got a button that's going to make that bow tie spin, so go ahead and do it, Jonathan. Oh, he didn't. Jonathan, thank you so much. People want to learn more, go to heritage.org. What a great organization. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.